So I'm delighted to be joined by Martin again. Martin, nice to see you again. Are you well?
Very good. Am I turned on? Yeah, very good, thanks.
You are live and we can hear you. So nice to see you again. And I know you're a busy man at the moment with the current furore. So thank you for joining us. And Tim, welcome back. So Tim, again, delighted to see you. So Martin, of course, is a very highly respected and vastly experienced AML practitioner and now consultant and worldwide expert, talking and opining on AML, working with all sorts of government agencies and the compliance profession as well around the world to continue to combat the influence of money laundering worldwide. And delighted, as I say, Martin, you can join us. And Tim, of course, we've seen you before at our compliance festival. Tim is our Director of Training Education Development, Head of Training Education Development, leads on a lot of our financial crime programs as well. Great experience as a regulator as well and a practitioner. Tim, thank you very much for joining us as well. So, Martin, sorry, Tim, I'm going to pass to Tim in a minute to basically ask some questions of you, give you a bit of a grilling, really. Let's have a debate. Let's have a debate about the storm we're in the middle of here. I'll come and I'll ring the bell if it gets too bloody. All right, we have to start mopping up. But let's have an honest debate. Let's get some questions from the audience too about, what are people's views on what this latest in a line of exposés tells us about the state of anti-money laundering efforts and the world's efforts in general. So again, I'm going to pass to you, Tim, to maybe kick us off with some questions for Martin. And then I'll sit in the background initially, but I probably won't be able to resist the urge to jump in and ask the questions as well and join the debate. I will also keep an eye out for the questions coming in from our audience, and I will feed those to you as well, gentlemen, as we go through. So, Tim, I'm going to pass over to you to kick us off, if I may. Thank you.
Becca, thank you. And for a moment, and I thought you'd promoted me in the field, and turns out that wasn't quite the case, but thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Give it 6 months.
Give it 6 months. Okay, thank you, Martin. It's great to join you for a discussion at I think a really interesting time, and of course we're going to talk about the FinCEN Files over the next 30 or 40 minutes, and I'd like to do that in two parts. Firstly, by considering a more strategic level, well, what actually happened and why it matters at a global level, recognizing, of course, that people have joined us from all over the world. But in the second part, it would be really useful to start to consider what it means for compliance professionals, to unpack this a little and look at the implications locally. Before we do all that, though, just from me, a very, very quick summary of what's happened. As Becca said, you'd need to have been living under a rock to have not picked this up. On Sunday, the ICIJ published articles linked to 2,100 suspicious activity reports disclosed from the US regulator and FIU FinCEN. There's been a significant investigation in respect of those, and it prompted something of a media storm, including on Monday in the United Kingdom, a documentary that you featured in, Martin, by Panorama, looking at the leak and the implications of it. The publication of so many suspicious activity reports is sobering. I think we'd all agree, and anyone that's worked within compliance will know that this is ultra sensitive information, and it's provided by financial services in the absolute expectation of secrecy. That's something I think we need to keep in mind. But nonetheless, this information now is published, it's out there, and it's generating a lot of noise. It's noise that relates to banks, it's noise that relates to politicians, and the relationship with, or apparent relationship with, criminals. Figures around $2 trillion have been mentioned within the papers. And of course, this relates to the period between 1999 and 2017. So what I'd like to do, Martin, is start by saying that I think we would all recognize that over the last 15 years, the financial sector and banks in particular have made fantastic progress in countering the threat of money laundering. Huge investment, billions of dollars. The culture of financial services increasingly places compliance at its heart. And there are thousands, many thousands of passionate, engaged compliance officers that work many, many hours to counter the threat. So with all that in mind, I've picked up, and colleagues have picked up, a real concern that this recent disclosure, and Martin, your role within it, feels like a betrayal of the work that they're doing. So can I start there with that question? How would you respond to that?
Let me just take one thing from what you said and then perhaps even add to that. I don't agree with you that there's been a fantastic progress in stopping money laundering. The figures don't agree with you. We are still seizing less than 1%, and the fines that banks are paying haven't really gone down. And this is not a Martin Wood show. If people want to personalize it, I think you'll do yourself a disservice. I think it represents a fabulous opportunity for the global AML community to actually make some fantastic progress, to review and say, what is our relationship with the reporting regime, with money laundering? Do we need to move away from a reporting and intelligence gathering to, as David Lewis said even this morning on a LinkedIn post, stop money laundering. Stop money laundering and save lives. Because what those leaks suggest in many instances, that's not what happened. Now, whether that was if we want to look at blame, whether that was a fault of the law enforcement, the authorities or the banks, again, I'd rather stay away from it and not look at blame. The fact is we didn't stop the money laundering. I think the public looking at the reports, looking at the TV shows, do ponder what was the point, what all these reports were made, what did the police actually do? But it's not a betrayal. It's actually, it's just standing up and being honest, because if anybody saw the programme, when I was asked about the UK being a high-risk jurisdiction, I recall I said, hurrah. So to some extent, I celebrate that. And let me try and justify it. The reason I celebrate it is because we need to acknowledge it and change it. We cannot live in denial. And so, Tim, we cannot say we've made fantastic progress when we haven't. That's actually denial. We cannot say that the overall wider regime, that's just not just the banks. The banks, I think, have spent a fortune, and I don't think that's being matched by the public sector, and that's a problem. But whether or not the banks got a bang for their buck, the figures don't suggest they have, because they're still suffering huge penalties, as are our shareholders, and we aren't actually being effective. So I didn't betray anybody. I actually took part in an exercise to make sure that this came out so that we could change things. And what happened? At long last, after decades of abuse and misuse and poor regulation and legislation at Companies House, the UK government announces a change. The US government announces a root and branch review of its effectiveness. And overnight, Westpac changed its plea to guilty, which I assure you will in part be predicated upon these leaks, because a lot of that is around correspondent banking. So change is happening. This is part of that change. And I say to everybody listening, do you want to be part of the change by driving the change, or do you want to be driven by the change? Now is your time to step forward, voice your opinions, innovate, articulate, and then we will have some fantastic progress.
Martin, that's really helpful. And I ought to say that what I hope to do is represent a number of interests, and they don't necessarily represent my own views. You'll understand that. But can I pick up on one of the things that you said? There has been a great deal of investment. I'm sure that you would agree. I think what you would concede is whether that's been effective, whether it's represented value for money. So what has gone wrong?
Well, this is not product placement, right? But I'm working here with the ICA. Training's gone wrong significantly. People have not understood what they're doing. And as I said on Panorama on Monday night, we haven't joined the dots. We've lost the plot. We've lost a recognition that the proceeds of crime come from crimes where people are killed, people die. In the United Kingdom, the drug overdose rate has increased by deaths from drug overdoses has increased by 47% in the last 10 years. That's part of money laundering and fiscal crime, and that brings it closer to home. 250,000 Mexicans are dead. And we're moving billions and billions of dollars for these crime groups. We need to get back to that. Remember what we do, as David Lewis says, and I'll say it time and time again on this conversation, when we get out of bed in the morning and we go to work as financial crime professionals, our primary objective is to stop money laundering and save lives. So we need a rethink.
So jumping in there, and just to clarify, David Lewis, of course, is the secretary for the Financial Action Task Force. And he's been quite vocal, hasn't he, over the last few days. Some of the things he's said have been quite surprising, Martin, certainly from my perspective, where he's commented that we need to change our approach. We need to be, as you've said, more innovative. What does that mean, though? What does that change look like?
Well, on a risk-based approach, I mean, so David needs to cascade his message through national governments, through the G20, so that governments adopt that mantra. What we're doing now is stopping money laundering to save lives. I note that the UK Treasury Select Committee now have asked questions about why is the UK being labelled high risk, and letters have gone out to the CEO of the FCA and to others. And I think, as well, as a former police officer, one of the problems that have happened here, and I speak from the UK perspective, but I think it's similar globally, except for America, and I'll come to that in a moment. It's a criminal law. You and I are both former police officers, Tim. And money laundering is a Proceeds to Crime Act, and albeit it's called a money laundering regulations, it's still a criminal law. And we've given it to regulators who also regulate treating customers fairly, handling client money, and they treat a criminal law like a regulation. In fact, they administer a criminal law because they don't actually apply it. And what's gone wrong is we have not held individuals accountable for their actions. As a consequence, we've encouraged them to do it again and again and again. So there needs to be a public policy change of strategy to move away from huge fines against corporations to identifying criminal culpability against individuals and making them accountable for their actions, making people frightened to launder money.
And if I understand,
Martin, can I jump in there? Sorry, Tim. Martin, can I jump in there? We are going to actually launch a poll in a minute, just to get a view from the audience about their take on FinCEN, the FinCEN League. But can I just come at it from a different angle? The information I've seen, the media coverage has been very focused, and rightly in some cases, on the pretty lamentable failings in banks. Sometimes once they've reported to maybe stop criminal flows of money and exit clients. However, isn't the real problem here at a governmental level? Graham Barrow's made the point in a very articulate fashion about that it's taken 400 journalists, all this time to sift through 2,000 SARS, and yet here in the UK, what have we got in the NCA FIU? 120 odd staff, and of course worldwide. I talk to a lot of FIUs; they are very much under-resourced, struggling, and it's been made even worse. The level of operational information being shared between FIUs has been really damaged by COVID. And it's that lack of government investment and FIU engagement rather than the banks we should be really pointing the finger at, or is it both? What are your thoughts on that? And then perhaps while you're articulating that, Karen, if you could launch our poll as well. Thank you, Martin, please.
Okay, so I as I say, we said at the beginning, I'm not pushing out blame. I will tell you, I looked at some of the SARS and I said to the journalists, I said, I don't know why they were filed. I said, I can't see any suspicion there. Somebody wrote up that they suspected layering. Okay, but layering is not an offence. And I don't think some of them were well written. I absolutely agree. And we stick with where the SARS come from, and we're hidden here in the UK. And I was engaged to reference UK issues and some US issues by different media organisations. There are two huge sarcasms, right, into which these SARS go. And that's back to what I said earlier on. We have become a reporting and intelligence gathering business. We've not applied the resources at a public policy level to act upon the intelligence. That needs to be addressed. But also, Becca, we've been looking at how do we change the SARS that we get more effective SARS. If you speak to Nigel Coles, who's a former head of the FIU, he'll tell you of a SAR that was for a first-class stamp that he said that the accountant said the customer used it for personal business, not personal life, not business. He filed a SAR about the misuse of a first-class stamp, when a first-class stamp was a lot cheaper than it is now. that, you know, that to the letter of the law was correct, but how does that help? And should we have had a de minimis level a long time ago? Because right now, the Commissioner of Police in the City of London has said they're really not investigating online fraud. So how are these SARS in truth not investigating? They're happy to have the intelligence to use later on, but that's not fair on banks spending all that money and all those resources to give you a piece of intelligence that you might one day use. That's not really what this was designed for.
Can I pick up on that, Martin? We know that in the UK, approaching 500,000 suspicious activity reports are submitted every year. In the US, that number is counted in the millions. We also know that it's not leading directly to clear law enforcement outcomes. As you say, there is a lack of resource or willingness to investigate and follow through in relation to this. But again, both of us are former police officers. We know how resource intensive a fraud or money laundering or corruption inquiry is. And to deal properly with what nearly 500,000 SARS would require, well, probably just about every police officer to do nothing else, nothing other than handling those SARS and following up. So where is the right balance here? How has that gone wrong?
Well, Tim, when I was in the police and the crime squad, that system was built for 12,000 SARS a year. That was the anticipated numbers. And obviously we've gone to a different place and we haven't kept pace with it. But we haven't had as well people with the courage, which is what, and I think David Lewis is encouraging people to do, have the courage to confront it, rip it up and start again if needs be. But a risk-based approach doesn't incorporate a zero tolerance of failure. So if the police aren't making use of that, can we in the banks and the financial services make better use of our time, and can we be given some leeway? You know, what we need to also recognize, you know, we are about stopping money laundering. If you look at the statements from the CEOs of banks, I have the one for HSBC here right now, and they are about working with regulators and stopping people abusing the financial system. So we need to understand that we can go to that next level and stop. And we should go to that next level and stop. We should take on board exactly what you just said, Tim. There's 500,000 SARS in the UK, millions in the US. Law enforcement is not properly looking at them. You should not sit and wait for law enforcement to come back to you and say, oh, yes, we're interested in that one, because that's a very remote possibility. In the meantime, if you do nothing, you are going to sit back and watch people launder money, which is not what you want. It's not what your CEOs want within their statements, and it's not what the communities where you live and work and operate want. They want you to stop money laundering.
So can I thank you, and I absolutely agree with what you've just said, but can I go back to something that you said prior to that, which was talking again about David Lewis. He was saying that we need to be innovative, and this links to a wider debate around reactive or proactive response within financial services and other regulated entities. But I think many banks would say they're tightly confined within the relevant legal and regulatory requirements. And they of course, are based upon the 40 recommendations that come from the Financial Action Task Force, from FATA, from David Lewis. So it's quite difficult to be innovative when you're quite constrained with some narrowly defined recommendations and the law that comes out of that. Would you agree? Is that a fair observation?
I'm going to disagree with you, Tim, and I'm not going to try and pick a personal argument with you, but you haven't worked as a money laundering reporting officer in a regulated firm. The key thing here is it is risk-based. And I've never failed a regulatory examination. I've had several. I've closed multiple accounts. I've filed hundreds of SARS. I'm proud to say I think I've stopped lots of money laundering and frustrated lots of criminals. The innovation that David may be talking about, if you recollect, when I was at the last festival, we got to the point of speed cameras, and he said to me afterwards, he said, I really like that. I might use that. I said, well, you can only if you give me credit. So in the future, if he references speed cameras and doesn't give me credit, please tell me. But in the roads in the UK, if I take, which is what I'm familiar with, if I take the UK, speed cameras are only placed where the accident happens to stop other accidents happening. And they have to apply a penalty to actually make them effective. Our problem in transaction monitoring, in our KYC, and the way we've gone about our business, and it might be, Tim, as you say, an interpretation of the regulations, is we're not at all as risk-based as we ought to be more effective. We need, again, it's for David, and I support you, David, but you have to cascade that message through the G20, through national governments, and drive a change of regulatory approach that gives the hardworking, passionate AML community, and that's what they are, that leeway to be innovative, to be effective, and to stop the bad guys.
So what I'd like to do, Becca, with your support, is move the discussion on now to think a little about the practical implications for compliance officers. I think it's been really useful exploring.
Just before we do that, Tim.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, just so we do have the results from the poll that's come in.
Okay.
So the poll results, the question that was asked of the attendees was, do you feel that the FinCEN files are a positive development overall? We've had 49% yes, 27% not sure, or it's changing as I speak, and 24% no. So it's a majority, but not an overwhelming majority for positive view. So that's quite interesting. Sorry, Tim, to cut across you.
No, but
okay, so before I ask you to move on, can I just feed one or two questions that have come in, Tim, and before I ask you to move on? And I'm interested to get your views on this. And this is a common issue that I have seen raised by firms, Martin, which is about if banks are going to decide to close client relationships and bank accounts because they've had no response from an FIU due to the issues you've just discussed, there will be possibly scandals, implications there, challenges from regulators, media, adverse media, reputational risk, litigation. What are your thoughts on that observation from one of our members of our audience?
Well, that's down to let's conduct the proper investigation in the first instance. And you shouldn't be closing them because you didn't get a response from the authorities. You should be closing them if you think they're laundering money. That's your premise, not because you've passed the buck onto the authorities and they haven't come back to you. But if you've conducted a proper investigation, which may include talking to your customer, that's where this has gone wrong a lot, and you've got to blame the authorities for that, because even now the NCA say you should never discuss or tell anybody about the filing of a SAR where there's a risk that it will prejudice an investigation. That's a fundamentally flawed and improper piece of advice, because it intimidates compliance professionals not to talk to their customers. And as you rightly point out, Becca, the customer may be in a position to give you a logical and reasonable explanation of the unusual activity in the account. So we need, again, that sense of what can we do here? But if you've undertaken a proper investigation, you'll be in a much more confident position to make that closure or to retain the account.
I'm going to shock you here, Martin. I'm going to shock you. I'm going to shock you here, Martin. I'm going to agree with you.
I've got something in the seat that you can shock me with.
When investigating SARS as a former MRLA, investing that side of it, and working with the enforcement authorities, just because you don't understand a customer's transactions does not make it suspicious. And I've heard very many senior AML investigators make that point. If you reach the conclusion that you are not comfortable with the risks, then you need to follow your own internal escalation procedures. And the larger banks that Tim and I work with, they have very robust procedures around client selection and exit committees and structures. And it's all about risk appetite. And I absolutely agree, just because you don't have an answer from an FIU is not grounds to remove a customer. So I think we're agreed with that. But I do accept the point that
it's also
there is pressure on banks.
It's not the grounds to do nothing more. It's not the grounds to do. It's what do you do after filing the SAR is important.
Yeah. So I think I would agree with you that filing a SAR is not the end of the story. You don't tick that box and say, I've now discharged my legal and regulatory responsibilities. Of course, it should be, and the law is very clear in most jurisdictions, it should be a trigger for a full CDD review. And, if you feel serious enough to submit a SAR to the right level of quality it should be, of course you should be asking, is this really a client relationship that we should continue? And I don't think any right-minded compliance professional would disagree. Sorry, Tim, over to you.
Thank you. So in a moment, we're going to focus on the implications at a more local level. But before we do, can I ask one question, which is actually about the UK? And I appreciate, of course, that many people that are joining us this afternoon won't be from the UK. But the programme on Monday, the Panorama programme, that you were part of, Martin, you'll know that it was particularly focused on the UK. There was a suggestion that the UK is a, paraphrasing, but is a money laundering hub across the world. Now, you and I know I've run investigations, money laundering investigations at a strategic level that have identified networks across the entire world, places like Dubai, Colombia, Spain, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. Money laundering is very much a global problem. So I think what I want to ask is it reasonable to isolate the UK as a particular hub? What are your thoughts around that?
So there's two things that play into that. The UK is the #1 financial services centre in the world for legitimate financial business. To give you some context around that, every day, $280 billion of equities may be traded, similar, maybe smaller sum for bonds, and there'll be 5 trillion of foreign exchange, of which over 33% will be traded in London on any given day. As a consequence of being the biggest financial services centre, we have lots of businesses, and there's always been a sense if you get your money into and out of London, it's clean money because of the perception of good laws and good regulations. And yet the Companies House debacle shows that's not true. That's not correct. And moreover, it was the FT published last week that the FCA have dropped 50% of their ongoing criminal money laundering investigations this year. There's some context around that, but the FCA have never criminally prosecuted anybody. Comes back to what I say about they treat it like a regulation. And it also adds to, if we don't prosecute people, it won't happen. Now, let me just finish one thing on that. Earlier this year, the FCA applied a fine of about 38 million to Commerce Bank, translated to dollars, about $48 million. In 2015, the US authorities applied a fine of $1.5 billion. So if you are a money launderer, or a money laundering bank, and you have a risk-based approach, where's a better place to launder your money?
I see where you're going with it, Martin.
I'm not going to America. It's dangerous.
That I think could apply in a number of different contexts.
Can I just make one observation, Tim? I know there might be a bit of a lag with me on my line here with you. I do think there's a danger, though, that the media likes to bash banks, and let's be honest, often totally justifiably, yeah. But what we never hear is the positives, and you've seen this, Martin. You've seen this, Tim. We've all worked where we've seen and actually worked on cases where the banks have uncovered and helped play a central role in the actual prevention of complex money laundering schemes. And what often gets forgotten is stop the underlying terrible harms that are done. Only last week I was talking to a bank about a specific case involving people trafficking. And be it drugs that kill people, be it human modern slavery, be it wildlife crime. The banks are doing a huge amount of work, and yes, they are failing in areas, and clearly the figures are depressing reading. But I think the danger is that we forget and we never highlight some of the positive work that is done by the banks in this regard. And I do feel that some of the recent reporting has lacked some balance in that respect. Again, a personal view. So, Tim, I'll pass back to you. And we've got some more questions coming in, but let me know, Tim, when you want me to feed you some more questions, and Martin as well. I'll let you continue your conversation.
Okay, thank you. And can I just pause and check that you can hear me correctly, because I'm getting an odd message. You can. Thank you. So we're moving now just to think about the practical local implications. Now, I was talking to several members of an FIU earlier on today, and I asked them what their concerns were as a result of this leak. And their immediate response was that they feared that there'd be a loss of trust. Their concern is that their relationship with financial services is absolutely underpinned with trust. And if MLROs and others within financial services are concerned or fearful that information that they put into a suspicious activity report could be compromised in this way, that it might have an impact on what they're doing. So I'm not sure this is an entirely fair question, but I'm interested in your thoughts there, Martin. How can we rebuild that trust? Because I think you'd agree it's an important ingredient in that relationship.
Yeah, and actually, there's been lots of commentary online about this. And we should, in a way, be grateful that these SARs fell into the hands of very professional responsible journalists who were sensitive to the personal information of the banking staff and have protected that information, redacted it. There was clearly a security failure at the US Treasury. And therefore, this information could have fallen into the wrong hands, and a banking member of staff could have been killed as a consequence of this. Let's not kid ourselves. So there is an important rebuilding of trust, and it's mainly for the law enforcement agencies to give that reassurance and to hopefully, some of them are doing penetration tests right now. Others are reviewing can you take things out on a USB, and they're doing that pursuant to what happened. And they're going to give that level of reassurance because, Becca, it does fit in a bit with what you've said. We are terrible at this narrative about what we do well, but it's not always easy to spin. How do you tell the world you stopped the catastrophe? Because it never happened. But very oftentimes, that's what we do. And I wrote for you and for Compliance Week not so long ago the story about how HSBC were instrumental in recovering that 500 million for the people of Angola when Dos Santos tried to steal it. So we need to collectively as a community, how are we getting on with our own PR departments, our own communications department, say, we've got an important message to get out today. We did a great job. You can't do it in America because the SAR doesn't exist. You cannot talk about the SAR. So it's a bigger breach in America. You can be stood in a witness box in a civil proceedings in America and be asked by the complainant solicitors, did you file a SAR? And you cannot answer that question yes or no. So it is a very significant breach to the US and that trust. And again, let's not go blame pointing on that, but it does reference there was a serious security flaw at the US Treasury.
So if I can pivot a little and take a different perspective on this. So I imagine that many of the people listening today and joining us will have senior positions within compliance roles across many different regulated entities. What would your message be to them in terms of how we should respond to the challenges presented by this? Do we need to change the way that we build our framework, our controls, the way in which we do our risk assessment? I'm trying to actually look at some practical thoughts from you around what we should be doing in response to this.
Well, let's not call them challenges. Let's call them opportunities. The cat is out of the bag, ladies and gentlemen. The public around the world have been told that in terms of anti-money laundering, collectively, all of us, from the FATF down, and remember David Lewis said we're all doing badly, some not as badly as others, so he admits his organisation is not doing so well. It is an opportunity for us to grab hold of this, to innovate and work out how we improve. And if we have been, and we collectively on this side of it, I've always been frustrated at what we sense as a lack of feedback about SARS. Now there's a sense lack of action. How do we then engage with the public sector and say, at what point do we get a mandate from you to close? Or do we actually have to speak to our internal lawyers? Where do we go with this and say, let's align our actions within our own anti-money laundering financial crime department with the statements on financial crime and anti-money laundering from our CEOs? We are going to stop these people abusing the financial system. We are gatekeepers of the financial system. We have to keep these criminals out. We have to be one step ahead of them. Let's start to live that statement in our actions.
So you would be asking then an MLRO or a head of compliance to ask questions of their own systems, to ask, are they effective? Are they doing what it says on the tin? Or are they an exercise in compliance only that doesn't necessarily make a difference? Or am I paraphrasing you unfairly?
You are listen, you're interpreting it. That's not so that's in fairness to you, you're interpreting what I've said. But look at some of the things that came out of Monday night's panorama and what's come out all over the world. There's an address in the United Kingdom in Potter's Bar, Suite 2B 175 Darkers Lane. It is in the top 10 highest risk money laundering addresses in the world, published by FinCEN. How did that happen? Now, let me tell you, from all my experience, I can present to you 5 other addresses in the UK that are probably a higher level of risk, where there are thousands and thousands of companies and partnerships at those addresses. As I said to you the other day, you can tell which ones they are because a postman's got a really bad back and hates the addresses. But in terms of proactive business, we could put those addresses into our system and say, we don't do business there anymore. And if I can put it into this context, we need to look outside of financial services for lessons. Let's go back to that airport again, as I always go back to. If we were handling suitcases that might get on an aeroplane with 350 passengers on board, would we accept the suitcase from a corporate entity at Suite 2B, 175 Darkers Lane? I like to think we wouldn't. So treat your business that you are managing and protecting the safety and security of your staff, your customers, and your communities. You are managing what gets on that plane. You're managing what comes into and goes out of your bank. There's fabulous risk information out there, and a lot of it came from there. If you were to proactively apply that, you would frustrate the hell out of some of these bad guys.
So again, can I pick up on what you've just said, proactively applying it? So what we're talking about here is the challenge presented to financial services in particular, but all regulated entities, when they're entering into or in a relationship with a company or a trust or some other vehicle that allows the owners, the controllers, to be concealed. The challenge is determining who that beneficial owner is. And of course, the address that you've given, we know, has been used to conceal that ownership. This is a challenge that compliance officers are facing around the world on a daily basis. Again, just wanting to be practical for a moment, you mentioned being proactive. What sorts of things do you have in mind there?
Two things to pick up on. One of the things we should think about is putting this KYC back on customers. You go to an airport, your passport identifies you. You go to an airport and say your suitcase belongs to a BVI company. As somebody at the airport, I'll throw it away. It's not getting on a plane. I don't care who owns it. It's none of my business. We allow customers to dictate the terms in financial services. And I'm going to try and run around and find out who owns the company you're trying to open an account for. It's incumbent upon the customer to do that. And we should perhaps look at our terms and conditions of business. That's being proactive as well. Look at your terms and conditions of business through an AML lens. What can you do to actually improve your processes, make it more of a hostile environment for the money launderers? And actually, there's lots of black box data out there. What I mean by that is all these money laundering scandals and investigations in the laundromats, it goes more to that. Can you take some of the addresses, the LLP entities, Scharborg LLP, the one in the Deutsche Bank mirror trading? I'm an anorak in this space, I'm sure you've worked out. So I went 100 numbers up and 100 numbers down from that LLP. And I can tell you that in excess of 50% of the LLPs incorporated in that batch of 200 were connected to prior money laundering nominee partners and addresses. 50%. So Companies House was launching over 100 avatars to go and launder money. So, but we were in the front line for that. And most firms in the UK, so speaking from a UK's perspective, they won't entertain these LLP entities as a customer. But if you won't take them as a customer, you shouldn't take them through your payment systems either. Okay. You can't one time remove it. You should be actively screening for these companies and these addresses to stop it.
So there's an opportunity to use some of the very rich sources of information that we have, but there's also an opportunity to put the onus on the customer to demonstrate ownership to the satisfaction of relevant individuals within the bank. Going on from that though, if I was head of compliance or MLRO, how should I measure success? What does success look like now?
So I'll draw my own experience from that. My success was as I closed out these bad relationships, I began to get bored. That was a measurement of success because there was no more to close out. Success is more people begin to recognize it, and people said that customer's no longer on the platform. Why is that? And we'd never answer it, but they began to work out what we were doing, and they could see that we were getting rid of bad actors. And then people said to us, we come to you because you ask questions of us that we want asked of others. And you give us more assurance that we're dealing with the right counterparties because of the due diligence processes you apply. And you're also fair about it. You also deal with it quite well. I think training is really important here. And actually, can you get something that joined all the pieces together? Motivation. Because I think we said this the other day when we were preparing for this, there's some degree of demotivation from this. What's the point of all these SARs that nothing happens and nothing does it with them? So if you are demotivated, how do we change that? If you're the head of AML, financial crime, what's the narrative you change? How do you use your CEO's statement about what he or she says about financial crime? And if you haven't got one, then get one. Get your CEO to make that statement.
Thank you, Martin. You mentioned demotivation. I'm mindful of the time, but just one more question at the moment from me, if I may. What I wanted to ask you is the compliance career, the compliance role. You're a former compliance officer yourself. And of course, we have, joining us this afternoon, hundreds of thousands of compliance officers across the world. There is a real danger, I think, though, that we see what the FinCEN files are saying about what we're doing, and that we feel demotivated by that. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you see compliance as a good career choice now?
I always have. I've always wanted to be presenting it to school leavers as to why it's a good career choice, because it's a growth business, isn't it? You know, until we get to the other side of it and where people are compliant, there'll always be a requirement for compliance officers. And as for the kind of demotivation, remember, to some significant extent, the banks complied with the law. They filed the SARs. There was some failings afterwards, I think, before the filing was so one bank didn't know its customer for 10 years and processed $1 billion. That was a failing, but they filed a SAR. Others filed a SAR and then 80 million went through the accounts, and they themselves called it a fraud, which is challenging, but they filed the SAR, so there was some stuff that came out of it well. And actually, we know, again, if we were better at speaking with our own PR departments, go back to HSBC, they filed a fabulous SAR. And as a consequence, they did save people's lives, because 500 million on the health service in Angola saves an awful lot of lives, So we need to be stronger in the narrative of what we do well. And that's part of don't be demotivated. Identify those ones and work out how you can get a stronger, more powerful narrative. Feel good when you're closing it out. Be innovative and actually ask yourselves again, go back to those addresses. You're not going to do business with anything from Suite 2B 175 Darkers Lane. You're going to prevent that. But there are many more addresses like that. And it's available from the OCCRP. The innovation is a lot of those transactions in their cases from the laundromats came from the same server. We need to be innovative in technology. Do we have a do not do business with device list? Because we understand that device contacted us and we don't like it. There's things we can do that are really smart, but then how do we tell that story? Do we want to tell that story? Because then people work out that that's one of our controls. Do we need to tell that story? Do we need to feel good about ourselves that we stopped them because we'd already seen them before, and our new processes, our new thinking, our new ideas are working, and they're frustrating the bad guys, and they are saving lives?
So there's a lot contained in that answer, Martin, that I could pick up on. But can I just say from my perspective that I absolutely agree with you. And I think I go even further and say that the solution to this, and I think we can be optimistic, we can expect over the coming years that we'll be more effective in countering money laundering, whether that's through regulatory change, legal change, whether that's through a more proactive approach, whether that's through effective use of data or new technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence. I firmly believe, from my perspective, it's going to get significantly better. And when I'm challenged in this way, and I don't know if you would agree, but I would also say, as well as the things that you're doing today, the solution is going to come from within compliance. It's going to come from what we are doing. It's going to evolve. And maybe we need to be patient to a certain extent to recognize the impact that we'll have in the future as well as currently. But Becca, are there any more questions that you'd like to share from colleagues?
Yeah, okay, so I'll just probably wrap us up with just one or two last questions. I don't know, Martin, if you've joined any of the sessions we had this morning, but we were talking about one view of customers, bringing in the KYC elements using AI. And actually, when we're doing transaction monitoring, we're not purely looking at, we're moving away at a rate of knots from purely rules-based to actually looking at peer group analysis plus the transaction in the context of what we know about the customer. Now, obviously, to the point you've made, if the bank hasn't bothered to even know its customer properly, that technology will be next to useless. But if we can continue to improve, I think you're right, some of this technology is very exciting. with the capabilities it could bring. So let me just throw in a couple of last questions before we wrap up in a few minutes. I'm just conscious we had so many questions and comments coming in. So thank you to all those. We won't get a chance to get to all of these. There's a question here about information sharing. And obviously FATF has promoted the kind of the gimlet model in the UK, and we're seeing that now being rolled out across a lot of jurisdictions, aren't we? And I'm not suggesting the gimlet model, if you're all familiar with it, Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, is a panacea. But the question here is, how do we make information sharing legal within peer groups and enforcement agencies? And why did FinCEN not do it? My understanding is under the US legal system, there are actually provisions for sharing intel, but they are quite formalized, aren't they? So I just wondered, how can we make this information sharing? So Martin, you mentioned, the sharing of addresses of the great information that OCCRP has, for example, and maybe sharing of specific typologies and intel. How do we improve that information sharing as a public and private sector community, all trying to stop money laundering?
Well, so the OCCRP, that's not sharing, that's usage. It's out there. It's on their website. Go help yourself and use it. And it is more restrictive in the US.
Yeah.
Again, back to your terms and conditions of business, consent overrides a lot of this. Not in terms of SARS, but in terms of customer data. If you think in correspondent banking, you have an issue with a UK LLP entity operating through, let's go through the classic scenario, a Latvian bank. Well, if you're the dollar clearer or the euro clearer, and this is how I operate, please get your customer's consent to give me a full KYC file for your customer. Absent your customer's consent, please tell them we cannot and will not process any more transaction for them. In correspondent banking, I have risk. I've got to run the rule over things. I can't have that information. What I can, if they consent to me having that information. Consent overrides so many laws. And if you look at consent requirements in your terms and conditions of business, some of those SARs that we looked at the other night, and Graham referenced one about round tripping and different accounts, and some customers held accounts in one part of the world with an organization and in another part, but the organization didn't know both parts. You could put the onus upon a customer that if you open another account with us and then describe that, is it 25% ownership, is it as a director, whatever you're going to put in there, anywhere else in the world, you have to tell us, because we have to maintain a whole picture of the whole customer view. But put more of the onus back on the customer and tell them if they don't tell you that, then I have to freeze their accounts, block their accounts, and they incur charges. Make the customer, because nobody knows the customer better than the customer, make the customer work with us. The customer at the airport, they say, if you leave your bag unattended, it may be blown up. Everybody else wants to hear that, to be reassured that when I sit on a plane, I'm not next to somebody who's carrying a bomb. The customers in the airline industry are part of the control. They subscribe to it and can contribute to it. We need to actually try to work out, how do our customers become part of our control mechanism by the ones that help us and give us information, make it easier. Do we say to them every 12 months, here's it is online, update your KYC, tell us what's changed about you, etc., etc. Can we do that? And then ones that maybe lie to us, we get rid of them, or the ones that aren't helpful. How can we help them, sort of get them to help us, rather than giving ourselves all the onus and all of the burden all the time?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, Tim, any final comments from you?
So yes, in the first part this afternoon, we've considered the nature, the impact of the FinCEN files. I think we recognised within that, just to summarise, that there is, if there's fault, well, there probably is, and it rests in a number of different areas. In law enforcement, perhaps, within the banks to a certain extent, within the regulators, within our politicians, and the way in which the laws have been enacted. I think we also recognise that there are some real challenges to find a meaningful way forward. There's no silver bullet contained within this. I don't think you suggested that there is, Martin, but I think you've also suggested that there's much more that we could be doing, and there's strong evidence, I think, to underpin that. I think to finish on a more optimistic note, we've touched upon the way we see regulation and the response within regulated sector and law enforcement developing over the next few years. We're starting to see very positive signs, as you've touched upon, Martin, of the the regulators and governments around the world actually responding to this recognition that it's not working terribly well. And it's reasonable to anticipate that that will continue. David Lewis steering FATF towards a more practical, outcomes-based approach to the threat. So it's been a really useful discussion from my perspective. I'm very grateful for your thoughts. And I think it's important that we leave it on a very positive note, that actually there's a lot that we can be optimistic about contained within this.
Yeah, and to some extent, the leaks are a catalyst for some of that change, that positive change. And I always, many of us have done these cultural courses in big firms. I do firmly believe that in change, that you should be driving it, not be driven by it. And, particularly for the younger people out there without the grey hair like me, please bring those ideas out. Bring the innovation from how technology can help us. Think about when you opened your account, what question you think you should have been asked but you weren't asked, and why it's important. And I leave it with this. Here's my very final thing with this. Many years ago, my dad used to carry a suitcase because in them days, suitcases didn't have wheels for those youngsters amongst us. So it was a lot of effort to do exactly what you do, to move a suitcase from one place to another. So initially they put 2 wheels on the back, then it was 4 wheels. Now they're 4 revolving wheels, and they're a very easy thing to move from one place to another. So we still achieve the same objectives with far less effort. I leave it with you this, ladies and gentlemen. Please be the people who come forward and put the wheels on the AML suitcase.
That's Sean. I think we'd all support that plea to the money laundering professionals, of the anti-money laundering professionals of the future. So thank you, gents. It's been a pleasure to discuss with you, and keep up the good work, keep up the insights, and keep up the good fight. And have a great rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us, Martin. Nice to see you again. And Tim, thank you again for leading the discussion, Martin, there as well. So thank you, gentlemen. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.